At the stage I've reached now in the recording of these videos for Lightroom, I've touched on practically every tool and option of real merit for photographers. And one of the things I've said a few times in these videos is that image editing is rarely made up of just one edit that changes an image from an ugly duckling to a swan. Our image editing is generally made up of a series of variable steps. Variable because in most cases all images are unique, unless they were shot side by side in a studio under controlled conditions, and even then sometimes we need to treat those two images in a different way. Each of the edit changes we make may not be significant in themselves, but when a number of steps are all added together, that's where we sometimes can turn our image from an ugly duckling into a swan. So there is one skill that all photographers need, and it's the ability to know what makes a great picture. If editing in Lightroom is likened to our in-car satellite navigation, inasmuch as both Lightroom and our satellite navigation can take us to where we want to go. But both of those are useless until we know where we're heading first. So in this video, let's take a manipulation of an image through from start to finish and bring all of the stages that we need together. To begin the process, I've come back to the library module here because the image I've chosen to work through, I think it may be a good idea to look very briefly at the metadata. And the sort of information I'm looking at is the fact that the capture time was 4:30 in the afternoon. Winter time in Australia, that's quite late. Probably we're only half an hour or more, or nothing more than that, when the sun's going to disappear. You can see the image dimensions, although that's not going to help us a great deal in the manipulation. 125th of a second at 5.6. Now that indicates I was probably hand holding this image rather than having the camera on a tripod. Focal length 16mm, but we've got an ISO of 100. So as long as the image is sharp, then everything should be there and ready for us to manipulate this in Lightroom. So let's take it and move to the Develop module. And as usual, I'm going to hit my Shift and Tab key to remove all of those palettes, but of course I need the one on the right, which I can bring back with the F8 key. So where am I going to start? Well, I think I'll start with my lens corrections because I'm using a wide angle lens here. I can't see too much evidence of a curved horizon, but I think I'll stall on changing that, but I'm going to go to the lens corrections. And what I am going to change is the chromatic aberration. I'm just going to tick the box to make sure if there's any, and it's probably going to be up and around here or even around there, it's been removed, and I'm pretty confident that that's going to do a good job. I think the next thing I'd like to do is to straighten up that horizon and decide if the horizon more or less is straight. So to do that, I can go to my crop overlay, and I can go to the angle option here, and I can click and drag and say to Lightroom, look, that part there really should be level, fix that for me. And once it's done, if I just hit the enter key or done down at the bottom right, I can evaluate that, and I think that looks okay. But I think I'd like to have a little bit of a crop of this image as well, so I'm going to actually go back to the crop overlay as well as straightening the image. What I'd like to do, as I moved up that bottom, I knew instantly that the lock was turned on the right hand side. So I'm going to go over and unlock that, because what I want to do is I want to be able to move up the bottom of the image but without affecting the left and right. So I'm going to put that back to as far as I can go. I want to use as much of the image as I can. You can see that my rule of thirds is getting close to the horizon, but not perfectly close. But then here we've got a very solid rock right in the most important part of the image. So that shape that I've just created there, I think, is going to improve the appeal of the image. One last look at the rule of thirds bottom line in comparison with the horizon, and I think we've got a level enough horizon for me to hit the enter key and move on from that position. Remembering, of course, in all things we do, we can go back and make a change because we're working non-destructively. My next stage is to open up the basic tab, because I'm going to want to make the first of my changes here. But in the introduction I did say we need to know what makes a good picture. What do we need here? Well, I think I need to enhance the foreground a little bit. We need colour, we need impact. We've got some quite nice colours coming through the rocks. If we can make more of those without overdoing things, we can do that. And we can certainly put a lot more power into the sky as you see it here. We've got a couple of people up here, and whether we need to use our spot removal tool to try to remove them, because they're not really big enough to feature in the picture, and they're a little too small to perhaps just leave there, but that's a personal choice too. So let me start off by looking at the histogram. Now remember, if we want to see the clipping warnings up here and here, I can either mouse over them and we only see some indication in the shadows, or I can hit the J key, which switches them on permanently until I hit the J key again. I think I'll get rid of them and I'll use just my eyes for a little while, but from time to time I might just take a look. So let's start then with the foreground. It's going to be enhanced with a degree of clarity. And straight away, whether you like that or not, I do. I think it's bringing that to life, but it does mean that I want to give a little bit more shadow detail in there. So I'm going to go to my shadows and I'm going to step those up too. Back to my vibrance, because I like to see a little bit of colour coming through there, and straight away we're getting a nice lot of interest coming through there, and the colours of the evening, being so close to sunset, are also coming through the clouds. But of course, this is what I mean about making a global change to an image. This now reflects the sort of lighting I remember when we were standing on that beach. But if I make the changes I've just made, although it does a great job on the foreground, it doesn't do such a good job on the sky, and that's pretty typical of our image editing in general. Now, whether I need any more blacks in that foreground, the best way to decide is to try it, because as I've said in other videos, I'm not always blinded by the histogram above, particularly when I'm going to manipulate an image in almost two halves. But here I'm not sure it's doing a great deal of good. We could take just a little bit perhaps, and it gives a little more contrast, maybe spread the whites a little bit. Let's just click the whites here and see what we're doing, or hover over them, and we're certainly not doing any damage in the foreground. So we've got a pretty good result so far. Let me shut down that split toning and get that out of the way so we can see that more clearly. I quite like the colour balance of this image now, but I'm going to just take a quick look to see if I can warm it slightly, because it was one of those very late in the day shots where the yellow of the clouds was quite strong. But again, you can see all of the changes I'm making here now are pretty minimal. And I think I'm more or less happy to live with what I've got there for a moment. Now I'd like to have a look at that sky, so I'm going to shut down the basic tab for a moment and open up the graduated filter. Just for a moment, I'm just going to put a random filter in place. Remember that when we draw those three lines down, the line at the top is going to signify the greater of the changes we're going to make. Down at the bottom, where the filter is transparent, there'll be no changes at all, and of course we've got the graduation in the middle, which we can make wider or shorter depending on how far we drag down those lines. So sometimes we can have a graduated filter down in that sort of position. I'm going to hold my Shift key and drag this down to try to level it up, and it doesn't seem to want to level up, so I'm going to hit the Delete key and I'll hold my Shift and draw another one, because what I can do here is maybe localize that gradient over this area, so I know that anything from there above is going to have maximum effect that I apply from the sliders on the right hand side. Now the first thing I want to do here is to drop the exposure down on those clouds, and you can see that the colours are now all coming through. I'd like to do something with the highlights too, just the highlights here, so we're getting a good glow. It's a little bit too warm for me, so I'm going to drop the temperature back just a little bit, trying to balance this all up with the foreground. And although I like the effect there on the sky, I'm not too keen on the blueness of the sky here. I'd like to do something with that. Well, perhaps we can wait until we back away from the gradient filter or graduated filter, and we can do something with that a little bit later on. But that's more or less how I remember this scene, with the light just catching these rocks very brightly there. Now, once we see that, we need to look at it and sort of stand back for a little while. I think perhaps we need to increase the exposure just a little bit. Let's take a look at, see how I had a little bit of a job to do that. That's better. Let's bring up the clarity a bit in the sky. And I think I'm more or less happy with the balance of the sky and the foreground, but I would just like to take a little bit of blue off the sky. Now I want to check to make sure I can do that, so I'm going to hit the Done button down below. I'm going to go to my Hue, Saturation and Luminance slider. Just a quick check to make sure the Saturation tab is selected, because that's the one I use most often. It stays selected until I change it, but a quick look, and I'll use the Targeted Adjustment tool. So I can go into the sky, I can click and drag, and I can take the colour off, or I can put lots more back in. But what I want to do is just take just a little bit of that off, just to make the colour a little bit more natural. And you can see down here, it's not a great deal, and that's what I mean about making small steps. So I'm going to live with that for a moment. But when I'm sitting back looking at the image, and if I hit the F key, is it going to show me that full screen? A nice way to just sit back for a moment and just take in what we have. And when I'm looking at that, I want to darken the foreground just a little bit. Now, I may be able to do that with the radial filter a little later on, but I think what I'll do is I'll pick up my graduated filter. And I'm going to, because I'm coming at this now for the second time, I don't have to remember to go up and select new. It's already selected from the top right of that little palette. So I can click and drag. And once I get it into a rough position, all I want to do here is just drop the exposure down a little bit. See, it's almost going too far. This might be one of those times when I need to drag this out a bit, make the distance a little bit further, and it may make it a little bit easier to control. Remembering, of course, we can double click these and they'll snap back, but I'm going to go and put my cursor in that box because sometimes I find that's the best way to work. Now, once I've got the shading on the foreground, what I can do is come back and decide if I want to bring it up or change it in any way. For the moment, I'm going to say done. We've got a little bit of burnout, or not burnout, but a couple of areas here which I'd like to see if I can deal with. So I'm going to switch to my adjustment brush. Now we're going to need to zoom in here, so I'm going to hit the Z key to zoom in, and I'm going to touch the spacebar, and I'll click and drag to locate the sky that I want. And there's one section of it. We'll settle on that one there. We can see the brush here. We know we can go down the bottom and tick the box to look at the overlay. So if I wanted to spray on there, a little bit of masking, there I can see exactly the effect. If we look at the flow rate down here, we're around about 35%. So let me take off that overlay so we can see what we're going to do here. And all I was going to try to do is to darken the highlights a little bit, maybe the exposure a little bit. Ooh, that was hanging back, those two sliders. Let me do that again. Let's drag that down a little bit and allow it to do its job. That's too much. Let's back off a little bit. That's looking a little bit better. And I think what I'd rather like to do is to take my brush and do a little more masking to make sure that whatever I'm doing here is not going to be visible when we drop back out to normal size. I would click and drag around the image because there are a couple of other areas that I would like to look at, and there you can see them, very small areas. Make an appropriate size brush and I can use the same settings, and now I can just be very careful just to take these down and make sure that we don't do any damage to the quality of our image. And I'm going to do that now to any other areas of the sky. Hitting the Z key, we can bring the image back on screen. There's one over this side, so perhaps this is one of those times when it may actually be quicker to bring the panel on the left back. You can see all the history states there, and we'll hit the Z key, but what we'll do is we can click the little box here which will snap to the areas we need to work in. So if we're going to do a bit of work there and a bit of work there and a little bit of work there, you can see the sort of thing I need to do here. It's delicate, we need to take a bit of care, but remember, if you overdo it, you can always go to the erase option and back off a little bit. But if you work in a measured way, that's generally not a big problem. We can usually just apply the changes to the level we really need. A little bit down there even. Tiny little areas, but we're just making small steps which are going to add up, I hope. If you look down at the bottom left of the screen, you'll see that I've increased the zoom to 2:1. And there's a little bit of noise coming through, showing more in the blue sky than anywhere else. And we can have a go at dealing with that in the Detail tab. And if I go down to the noise reduction, I'm going to just step the luminance up just a little bit. And I'm looking carefully at the sky, looking at the changes that are being made, and that looks pretty good. If I take something like 20–25%, it generally meets my needs, I find, and that looks pretty good. So I'm going to hit the Z key, and it should take us back down to fit on screen. It is doing that, but it's taken its time, and I've hit it again and it's brought it back up. So let me take it right the way down to fit on screen manually, and you can see that it's dragging a little bit. It's having a bit of difficulty now remembering all the changes we've made. And because I'm using a pretty old computer here, it's about 8 years old, you can see it's having an effect on the speed of the computer. I have mentioned this during the other videos, and there you can see evidence of it. Now, I don't think it's a bad thing sometimes when we're slowed down a little bit by our computer. There are times, I think, when we need it. Let's have a look and see if we can bring those two guys, or get rid of those two guys. If I can't, then we'll live with them because they're not significant. But let's see if we can actually do something. I think I need to zoom in first of all, so we need to get them fairly large. I think that looks pretty good. I'll just click and drag to get them to the left a little bit. And then pick up my spot removal tool and we'll have a go with that. Now remember, when we adjust the size of the brush, we can do that with the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P. I'm going to push the feather of this up quite a bit, I think, and I'm going to try to make sure the center part of my brush is over those two guys with a little bit to spare. Let's try that, and I'll just click and drag a little bit to the right. Now you can see what's happening. It's going to take just a few seconds. Now it's taken my version of Lightroom on this computer just a second or two to do that, but we are asking it to do an awful lot of work. To take the pixels within the ring on the right and to place them in the ring on the left and blend it all in so it's seamless. Now it's not done a bad job, but I think perhaps it needs a little bit of fine tuning. The feather command seems to be a bit high, and that's why we're probably seeing a ghost of the guy. So let's see if we can actually improve matters by dragging that down. And that looks better. We've got a little mark there which I think most people probably wouldn't even see, to be honest. We've got to be aware that we've got the image quite large on screen. But nevertheless, let's see if we can just improve it a tiny amount. I mean, perhaps I just need to move that pin a little bit to the right to see if it covers that up. Trying to make those changes was a little bit difficult, and it was made difficult really because I'm trying to record a video at the same time. But what I'm going to do is move away from the heel option of the spot removal, which tries to do an automatic blending around the edges, and I'm not sure it's actually working in my favour here. So I'm going to move to the clone tool. I'm going to try doing it with the clone tool. So we'll do the same as we did before. We'll just click and just drag and make sure we cover the two guys. Now when we look at our picture back at normal size and hit the F key so we can see it fully on screen. I think that's about as good a repair as we're likely to get there. And I think choosing between whether to have the people there or not, I think I'd rather go without them, because people tend to attract our attention. There's one other thing I'd like to do here. I'm going to pick up my radial filter, go to the center of the screen and click and drag, because I want to drag out a shape. We can move the shape around afterwards, of course, but generally speaking, it's not a bad idea to get it more or less right when you start. Down here I've got the feather set to 50%. What I'll do is I'll hit the H key so that loses the bounding box. And what we're going to do here is just darken down the edge of the image a little bit, just a touch, to throw emphasis into the picture, the center portion of the picture. And I think that's all I would like to do. There we can see the before and after. Now, doesn't that really annoy you? When you're halfway through a recording and it takes this time to decide it must tell me right now that the scan has been completed. Go away. Please ignore that intrusion. Now, I said that was the last thing I was going to do, but perhaps there is one other. Let me get rid of that, or click done and set it into the image for the moment, because one thing we need to do is to look around the sky to make sure there's no dust that we need to deal with. Now, to do that, the best thing probably is to bring the option in over here. We need to zoom in up to that top spot, so let's just move that up there so we can see it. Now we can move around. I think the sky is looking pretty good here because we didn't use a very small aperture, but click and drag to move along, and when and if we see any dust mites on the screen, those look like little bugs sitting there caused by dust on our sensor, then we're going to use our spot removal tool to deal with those. Now, in the preamble to this particular video, I said that image editing was generally a series of small changes. Quite a few small changes, particularly when you're recording a video. Now, your changes may not be quite as long as that. When you're recording a tutorial, there's often times when you make an error or the computer doesn't work quick enough and you have to go back and redo that. So there's probably a few more steps in there than I would normally get. But nevertheless, we're always going to see a large number of small steps. And finally, with all of the palettes hidden and the lights turned out, we can see the original image we started with, because I've made a virtual copy of the one we was working on and then removed or reset all of the changes we made back to the default raw file. And there's the image we've created. Not entirely sure why the image is losing its little thin white line on the right hand side. That's something that's applied by Lightroom. Let's try hitting the F key and fitting the whole thing on screen, and we'll see if it'll do it a little bit better in that fashion. I think I need to click the screen first because it's not entirely live. There we can see it's slightly bigger too. So there's the image we started with and the one we've completed. You notice as we skip from one to the other, it's taking just a few seconds to sharpen up the image. Now, that's giving you an indication that the computer here is just beginning to groan just a little bit under the weight of the changes that I've made to this image. But we're complete now, so we can relax.